Good to be with you all again. It's really fun to be with familiar faces and to celebrate again this time to be together. Our sermon today is going to be looking at a text from 1 Kings, but I want to give you a little bit of background before we begin. The text is about Elijah, the prophet of the people of Israel. But in chapter 18, what's happened just before is he's had this major showdown with all of the prophets of Baal. So all of the prophets of Baal were telling the king of Israel what to do and how to act, and were getting everyone in Israel to worship this false god of Baal. So what Elijah did is he says, okay, if your god Baal can set this altar aflame, then everyone will know that your God is true. But if my God, the God of Israel, can set my altar ablaze, then you will know who is the one true God. The prophets of Baal do everything they can, asking their God to set their altar ablaze, and nothing happens. It's a disaster for them. But Elijah calls upon God to set his altar aflame, and even though he's put a moat of water around it, everything erupts into fire. God shows up in grand style, showing everyone that this is the one true God, the God of Israel. Now, we begin our text today. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and he fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now, there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, I love this story about Elijah because it's so dramatic. And I love it so much that I preached on it last week too. But don't worry, I won't preach the same sermon. You see, about a year ago, I was invited to get to preach at Duke University's chapel, which is this beautiful Gothic cathedral. It's huge, stained glass ceilings. It's very, very pretty. And I preached on this text in Elijah. And it was a beautiful service, wonderful music. Afterwards, I got to sit with the dean of the chapel, Luke Powery, who took me to lunch. And we talked for 2 hours about how this sermon was helping him think about his own life. It was a great experience for a preacher, let me tell you. You don't get that many opportunities. So I was feeling really, really wonderful. Now, then I had to get on a plane. You see, within the last month, I was invited to go to a couple of meetings, both before my trip to Duke and right afterwards. I'm helping the seminary to write a very big grant that's being offered by the Lilly Endowment, and so they invite all the people who are working on these grants to come together. So that was in Indianapolis this Monday. So I fly to Indianapolis after a full day of preaching, and Monday morning, I'm in this meeting all day, and they put you at tables with people from these different seminaries that are representing other people applying for these grants. To my left was seated a couple of folks from a Lutheran Missouri Synod seminary, and to my right was a couple of folks from a Presbyterian Church in America seminary. Now, you may not recognize those denominations, and it may not matter to you. There's people who are wonderful and lovely in all sorts of different denominations. But my ears perk up because neither of these denominations ordain women. And I had just been preaching in a chapel the day before, feeling really good about myself, and now I was with people who wouldn't have allowed me to preach in their churches because of my gender. Now, I go to my hotel room later that day after a full day of meeting, and I tell God, "What am I doing here?" It was like God just put me right into that Elijah story, and I was being asked, "What are you doing here?" And I felt all of the self-pity of Elijah under that broom tree saying, "I have been zealous for the Lord, and now I'm sitting with people who wouldn't ordain me because I'm a woman, and I'm just grumpy." And I was asking God to speak to me in that still, small voice. I don't know if you've ever had those experiences of burnout of any kind, where you've gone from a really great experience in your life to something that felt a little bit humiliating or just a little bit exhausting, and you're like, "What am I doing with my life?" Those kinds of questions that Elijah gets on Mount Horeb. What are you doing here? Often those come to us not at our best moments, but when we are asking ourselves, "What am I doing here? Oh God, what is my purpose?" Or maybe we're in a time of discernment where we're being asked to take the next step, to do something different with our lives. Elijah was probably set to retire soon. In the next few verses, we hear God telling him who to appoint as his successor. So he's about to say, "What am I doing here, God? What's next for me?" Those can be really, really difficult times in our life when we're asking God, "What am I doing here?" But instead, in this text, it's God who asks Elijah, "What are you doing here?" Now, typically when I ask that question of God, I want an answer. I want a direct answer from God to tell me, "This is what you are supposed to do." When I was a sophomore in high school, and please stop me if you've heard this story, because it's a story I've told 100 times, but when I was a sophomore in high school, I felt called to be a minister. I was thinking about what college I should apply to, because as all sophomores in high school are having to think, what am I going to do after college? What am I going to say I want to go to college for? I was having all of those kinds of questions, and the thought of being a preacher came into my mind, but was instantly flooded with doubt. I thought, I can't be a good enough public speaker. I mean, y'all can hear me stammer and stutter from time to time. I'm like way worse in normal interactions. I'm like, I can't do this, and I can't be a good enough example. That's it. I'm not going to consider this anymore. A couple days later, I'm sitting with my youth director from our church, who just asked me, have you ever thought about going into the ministry? And I was like, well, yeah, but, and I gave him all of my excuses why I couldn't be called to be a pastor. And he said, well, have you heard about Moses? He had some of those same objections, and God sent him Aaron. And then the Apostle Paul also said that he had these weaknesses, this thorn in his side that he prays 3 times and asks God to take away. And you know what God says? My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, in that interaction, I heard a call from God to pursue going into the ministry, to become a preacher. But I want you to hear me. I didn't hear a direct voice from God saying, Carolyn, you should be a preacher. Because God's voice doesn't often come that clearly. Some people it may, but to me it was this conversation and this feeling, this response in community, being in conversation with someone else who saw my gifts and who asked me questions. In that encounter was this call from God. Now I say that because we hear in Elijah's story that when Elijah gets asked, what are you doing here? And gets told the Lord is about to pass by, that there's these dramatic things that take place, this crushing wind, this earthquake, this fire. And often when we're looking for direction, we want those same kinds of dramatic elements. We want those neon signs. But if we all had those neon signs all the time, what would we need faith for? Every time that we listen carefully with discernment, trying to seek God's will, we're stepping out in faith. We are using the faith that God is blessing us with to say, I think this is what God is calling us to do. I believe this is where God is calling me to go. Because if we could just hold up our phones and play a recording of God's voice, it would be a lot easier and wouldn't require as much risk on our parts to step out and to say, I'm going to do this whether I make myself look a fool or not, because this is where I feel God is calling me. Now, back to my meeting on Monday night, when I was experiencing that real exhaustion and frustration, I felt, again, this wasn't a clear voice, but in the silence, because luckily I had a hotel room to myself, there's no family around. As much as I love them, sometimes I need that silence to myself. And before I returned back to Austin, I was reminded of the job that I get to do. That I get to train up men and women to be preachers. I teach at a seminary, and through these grant programs, I get to help raise up lay preachers and lay leaders to tell their story of faith. And it reminded me of Elijah being sent out to go anoint his successor, that this ability to listen to God's voice isn't something we can do on our own. Elijah needed that angel to give him that food and water so he could make that trek up the mountain. Elijah needs his successor, Elisha, to come after him to fulfill this work. All of us need one another in order to do this work of faith. That all of us have a story to share. One of the gifts of getting to be part of this church and be with you all is that I know for a fact that you all have stories to share. I know that you all are living a life of faith where you've had experiences of burnout. You've gone through journeys where you've been wondering where God is. You've maybe had those mountaintop experiences of encountering God. I want you to share those stories with others because we need them. Preachers need to hear them. Every one of us needs to hear the stories that we have to share of how God is working in our lives. Because it is so, so hard to hear that still, small voice. The world is so chaotic and filled with things that distract us and that call our attention, and yet God is still speaking, whispering, calling to us, reminding us that God is still at work in the world. God is still redeeming this world, at work in my life and in yours. Will you hear the call? And will you answer it? Maybe you're not going to step up into this pulpit or the pulpit at Duke Chapel, which would be awesome, let me tell you. But maybe it's just in sharing it with somebody else. Maybe at your place of work, maybe over coffee, maybe in your neighborhood. Maybe you know somebody who really needs to hear how God has been at work in your life. Because in the midst of this wilderness that we are living in, we all need to hear, and we need that help from one another to hear that still, small voice. Amen.